3 days after my wife died in what police called a tragic highway accident, I stood outside a half-open door at her funeral and heard my son-in-law whisper, "I already removed his name from the backup system. Now find the blue notebook before the audit team does." Through tears, my daughter replied, "Mom must have hidden it." That night, a government investigator called and said, "Your wife left something behind. Come alone, and don't tell your daughter." I went, and the person waiting for me was someone who was supposed to have died 3 years earlier. If you're still here after that opening, thank you. That means everything on Dad Family Revenge. Drop a comment and tell me what country or city are you watching from tonight. I read every single one. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Names, places, and details are coincidental, but the lesson inside is something worth carrying with you. The budget meeting had been running for 40 minutes when my phone vibrated for the first time. I didn't look down. 29 years in public service had trained me to treat a ringing phone during a meeting the way a surgeon treats a sneeze mid-incision. You acknowledge it internally and keep your hands steady. The 7 people sitting around the conference table on the 14th floor of the Alfred E. Smith building were waiting for me to finish walking them through a $2.3 billion infrastructure proposal. And I was not the kind of man who lost his place mid-sentence. The phone vibrated again. Gerald Hurst. My deputy glanced at me from across the table. I gave him the smallest shake of my head and kept talking. The third vibration came 30 seconds later, and this time I looked down. Carol Hutchins. 3 missed calls in 4 minutes. My chest tightened before my brain could explain why. Carol was 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door to Eleanor and me for 11 years. She was the kind of woman who brought soup when you were sick and remembered your anniversary without being told. She was not the kind of woman who called 3 times in 4 minutes, unless something had already gone terribly wrong. I set my pen down on the table. "Gerald," I said, "take it from the traffic impact projections. I need a moment." I didn't wait for his response. Out in the corridor, my fingers were already pressing return call before the door closed behind me. Carol picked up on the first ring, and the sound of her voice, fractured, barely holding itself together, hit me like cold water thrown directly at my face. "Walter." She pulled a breath that shook. "Walter, there's been an accident. Eleanor's car. On the I-787 connector near the Key Street exit. They're taking her to Albany Medical." My hand gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. "How bad?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was a reflex I'd spent decades building and now wished I hadn't. "Walter, just go." Carol's voice broke on the last word. "Please, just go right now." I went. I don't remember the elevator. I don't remember telling anyone in the office where I was going or why. What I remember is the Albany sidewalk coming up fast under my feet, and the particular gray of a March sky that couldn't decide between rain and sleet, and the sound my car door made when I pulled it shut, which was exactly the same sound it made every other morning of my life. Albany Medical Center was 11 minutes from the office. I made it in 7. The emergency bay smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular quiet that hospitals manufacture for people who are about to receive news they can't give back. A nurse at the front desk looked up when I came through the sliding doors. Her expression shifted in a way that told me everything before she opened her mouth, and my legs nearly went out from under me right there on the linoleum floor. "Mr. Bennett?" she said. "My wife," I managed. "Eleanor Bennett. They brought her in from the I-787. Mr. Bennett." She came around the desk, and the fact that she came around the desk instead of pointing me toward a waiting room, was itself a sentence. Please come with me. The doctor was young, younger than Rachel, with tired eyes and the careful, rehearsed gentleness of someone who delivered this kind of news more often than any person should have to. He told me Eleanor's car had lost control on a rain-slicked stretch of the I-787 connector near Key Street, struck the concrete barrier and gone over the edge into the lower roadway. He told me the paramedics had responded within 4 minutes. He told me they had done everything they could. I'm so sorry, he said. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. My throat closed so completely I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. The doctor said something else, something about paperwork, about personal belongings, about a grief counselor on staff, and I heard the words the way you hear a radio through a wall. The sounds were there, but the meaning wasn't reaching me. A nurse brought a plastic bag. Inside Eleanor's wedding ring, still warm somehow, which made no sense and hurt in a way I couldn't locate in any particular part of my body. Her house keys on the keychain Rachel had given her for Christmas, a small brass letter E, her wallet. I sat down in a chair that someone had pushed behind me, and I held the bag in my lap and I looked at it for a long time. Eleanor had left the house at 7:45 this morning. I knew because I had heard her set her keys on the entryway table, that specific small sound she made every morning, setting the keys down and then picking them back up, a habit she'd had for as long as I could remember. She had said she was going to the library to meet an old friend. She had poured herself a cup of coffee and left half of it on the counter, which she did when she was running slightly late, and I had meant to mention it to her when she got home. She was not going to get home. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw stars, because I needed to feel something physical and specific, rather than the enormous, shapeless thing that was trying to expand inside my chest and crack me open from the inside. After a while, I don't know how long, I made myself look inside the bag again. Wedding ring, keys, wallet. I went through the wallet. Credit cards. Her library card, $32 in cash. A photograph of Rachel at about age 7, missing her 2 front teeth and grinning like it was the best day of her life. I set the wallet aside and checked the bag again. Then I checked it a third time, turning it upside down, running my hand along the seam at the bottom to make sure I hadn't missed anything. Eleanor's phone was not in the bag. I sat with that fact for a moment. The way you sit with a number that doesn't reconcile, turning it over, checking your work, looking for the error in your own arithmetic. Eleanor had not left the house without her phone in the 37 years I had known her. Not once. Not to get the mail, not to walk to Carol's front door. The phone was an extension of her hand, and its absence from this bag was as wrong as finding a set of fingerprints with one finger missing. I looked up and found the nurse who had brought me the bag. Her phone, I said. It's not here. The nurse checked her own records, made a call, came back with an apologetic expression. There was no phone recovered at the scene, Mr. Bennett. It may have been ejected during the impact. We can follow up with the officers on site. Thank you, I said. I sat back down. The library. An old friend. Half a cup of coffee left on the counter. Where were you going, Eleanor? The question settled into my chest like something with weight and corners. Something that would not dissolve the way grief was supposed to dissolve into numbness after the first shock wore off. It just sat there pressing against my ribs, insisting on itself. And why didn't you want anyone to know? Eleanor had always said that the suit I looked best in was the navy one, the one she'd picked out herself at a department store on a Saturday afternoon 3 years ago, steering me away from the charcoal gray I'd been reaching for, and saying with that particular certainty she reserved for things she knew were right. That one makes you look like a man who still has somewhere to be, Walter. I wore it to her funeral. It was the only decision I made in the 3 days between the hospital and the service that felt like it came from somewhere real rather than from the part of me that was simply going through the necessary motions of being a widower. The flowers, Carol had handled those. The funeral home, Gerald from the office had made the calls. Rachel had written the obituary sitting at our kitchen table with her laptop open and tears running silently down her face while Daniel stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, rubbing slow circles into her back. I had watched them and felt grateful and tried not to examine the gratitude too closely. Whitmore's funeral home on Washington Avenue could hold about 200 people. By 2 in the afternoon on Thursday, the 13th of March, there were at least 240. Eleanor had spent 30 years building a life in this city, colleagues from her days at the Federal Audit Office, neighbors, the women from her Tuesday book club, former clients, who had never forgotten the particular thoroughness she brought to her work. They filled the rows of pale wooden chairs and spilled into the foyer, speaking in the careful, half voices people use when they're not sure how much sound is appropriate. I stood near the front and shook hands and said thank you so many times that the words lost their shape entirely and became just sounds I was making with my mouth. Harold Vance arrived at 2:30. He was 67, broad-shouldered, with the silver hair and easy confidence of a man who had spent his career making rooms feel smaller simply by entering them. We had worked side by side at the Office of Budget Review for 22 years. We had lunch every Wednesday at the same diner on State Street. He knew how I took my coffee, knew the name of Eleanor's book club, had sat at our kitchen table enough times that he had a preferred chair. He crossed the room with both hands extended, gripping mine in the double-handed shake he saved for moments he considered significant. Walter. His voice was low and genuine-sounding, and full of a sorrow that looked from the outside exactly like the real thing. She was extraordinary. Every single person in that building knew it. We are all less without her. Thank you, Harold, I said, because there was nothing else to say, and because my throat had closed around anything more complicated. Rachel wept through the entire service in a way that made people 2 rows back turn their heads, deep shuddering sobs that bent her forward at the waist, her whole body shaking with the force of them. Daniel kept one arm around her shoulders throughout his jaw, set his eyes dry in the careful way of a man who has decided that someone in the room needs to hold things together and has elected himself for the job. He accepted condolences on Rachel's behalf, murmured quiet thank yous, steered people gently away when they lingered too long. Everyone remarked on how devoted he was. I watched them the way I used to review budget submissions, looking for the line item that didn't belong. The number that was slightly too round, the footnote, that almost explained itself, but not quite. I had been doing this my entire career. I was good at it. And something about the way Daniel's eyes moved around the room between condolences, not grieving, not distracted, but cataloging, made the back of my neck prickle in a way I couldn't justify and couldn't dismiss. I told myself it was grief making me paranoid. I told myself I was a 68-year-old man who had just lost his wife of 37 years, and that my instincts were not to be trusted on a Thursday afternoon in a funeral home that smelled like lilies and furniture polish. I almost convinced myself. After the service, I went back to the small room behind the main parlor to retrieve my coat, which I'd left on a chair near the door. The hallway was narrow and quiet, separated from the reception area by a half-open door, and as I came around the corner, I heard Daniel's voice. He was speaking quietly, the deliberate quiet of someone who knows they're in a public space and is compensating accordingly, and the sound of it stopped me 3 steps from the doorway. I already removed his name from the backup system, Daniel said, but we still haven't found the blue notebook. A beat of silence. Then Rachel's voice, tight and high and frightened, in a way I had never heard from my daughter before. Mom must have had it with her. If it's not in the car, it has to be at the house. Then we find it at the house. Daniel's voice hardened at the edges. We need it before the audit team knows it exists. Rachel, are you listening to me? This is not optional. Rachel made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been suppressed. Crying. I couldn't tell from where I was standing, and I discovered in that moment that I was pressing my back against the hallway wall, with my coat still in my hand, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. His name. Daniel had said his name. Which name removed from which system? And the blue notebook. I had no idea what that meant. Eleanor had kept notebooks for her whole career, color-coded by year, stacked in the second drawer of her desk. But Daniel Cross had no reason on earth to know that Eleanor owned a blue notebook. No reason to know it existed. No reason to need it gone before an audit team found it. I stepped into the doorway. Daniel's head came up instantly, and his expression shifted so fast I almost missed it. A full-body recalibration that lasted maybe a quarter of a second before the grief resettled over his face like a mask being smoothed back into place. Rachel looked up from where she'd been standing, with her arms wrapped around herself, and her face streaked with tears, and the relief in her eyes when she saw it was only me made my chest ache in a way I couldn't quite name. Dad. She crossed the room and pressed herself against me, her arms going around my waist, her forehead dropping to my shoulder. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're okay. I held her and looked at Daniel over the top of her head. He met my eyes steadily, his face composed and sorrowful, and giving away absolutely nothing. Walter, he said, I was just telling Rachel, and I think it would be a good idea if we stayed with you for a while. Just until you're settled. You shouldn't be in that house alone right now. Rachel pulled back and looked up at me with her mother's eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and asking me to say yes. Please, Dad. We want to be there. We want to take care of you. My throat hurt. My chest hurt. My daughter was standing in front of me at her mother's funeral, shaking with grief that was real enough that I could feel it when she pressed against me, and the man behind her had just said something to her in a closed room that made my stomach feel like it was full of ice water. Of course, I said. Come home. I smiled at Rachel. I did not look at Daniel again. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the wheel and tried to remember exactly what Daniel had said, word by word, in the order he had said it. I had spent 29 years reviewing documents for inconsistencies. I knew how to hold information still in my mind and examine it from different angles without disturbing it. I already removed his name from the backup system. We still haven't found the blue notebook. We need it before the audit team knows it exists. The highway lights swept past the windshield one by one, regular as a metronome. Whose name I thought. And why does it need to be removed? Daniel and Rachel turned in early. I heard their bedroom door close at 9:15, heard the faint sound of Rachel crying through the wall. A thin, exhausted sound, the kind that comes after a person has been weeping all day, and the body is running out of the energy required to do it properly. I stood in the kitchen with a glass of water I hadn't touched and listened until it stopped. Then I went to Eleanor's study. She had kept this room the way she kept everything, with a precision that looked effortless from the outside and represented, I knew, an enormous amount of quiet discipline underneath. Files arranged alphabetically on the shelves. Inbox and outbox on opposite corners of the desk, never mixed. The framed photograph of the two of us at Acadia National Park, positioned at exactly the angle where she could see it from her chair without turning her head. The photograph was facing the wrong way. I crossed the room and stood in front of the desk without touching anything, the way I used to stand in front of a flagged ledger before I started marking it up. The top drawer was pushed in slightly too far. Eleanor always left a half-inch gap because the drawer stuck if you closed it all the way, and she'd never bothered to have it fixed. The tax files on the second shelf were arranged by year, but whoever had gone through them had put 2021 between 2019 and 2020 instead of at the end. Nothing was missing. I checked carefully, methodically, opening each drawer and scanning each shelf. Whoever had been in this room had been looking for something specific and hadn't found it, and had been careful enough, almost careful enough, to put everything back where they found it. My stomach turned over hard. I called Rachel first. She answered on the third ring, her voice thick with exhaustion and grief. "Dad, what's wrong? Did you come into Mom's study today, before the service?" A pause. "No." "Why would I, Dad? What's going on?" "Nothing," I said. "Go back to sleep." I called Daniel next. He answered immediately, which struck me as odd, for a man whose wife had been crying herself to sleep 30 seconds ago. "Walter, everything okay?" "The study looks like it's been gone through," I said. "Some things moved around." "Oh." A beat of what sounded like genuine concern. "I think Eleanor might have been looking for something before the accident. You know how she was with paperwork. Or honestly, Walter, it's possible you're misremembering. You've been through something enormous today. The mind does strange things with grief." The mind does strange things with grief. I wanted to put my fist through the drywall. Instead, I said, "You're probably right. Good night, Daniel," and ended the call. I went to the front hall and pulled up the security camera app on my phone, the system Daniel's company had installed 18 months ago, a housewarming gift he'd insisted on after a neighbor's garage was broken into. Cross-data solutions printed in clean sans serif on the installation paperwork I kept in my filing cabinet. The footage from the past 48 hours was gone. Not corrupted, not buffering. Gone, a clean, deliberate deletion that had left a timestamp gap where 2 days of recording should have been. I opened the installation contract and read it through for the first time since I'd signed it. Full administrative access retained by cross-data solutions for maintenance and firmware updates. Remote access enabled by default. Daniel didn't just have a key to my front door. He had the ability to reach into the walls of my house from anywhere in the world and decide what I was allowed to see. I folded the contract, put it back in the exact position I'd found it, and turned off the light. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not yet, but from the particular fury of a man who has just understood that he has been trusting the wrong person for a very long time. I walked past the closed guest room door without slowing down. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I would start paying attention the way I should have been paying attention all along. The 2 days after the funeral passed, the way the days after a funeral always pass slowly and too fast, at the same time filled with casserole dishes left on the front porch, and phone calls I let go to voicemail, and the specific cruelty of waking up each morning and needing a full 3 seconds to remember why the other side of the bed was cold. Daniel and Rachel moved through the house like they belonged in it. Rachel reorganized the pantry because she said it helped her feel close to her mother. Daniel fixed the dripping faucet in the guest bathroom, which I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. They were considerate and present and helpful in every way that could be measured, and I smiled and thanked them and noticed everything. At 11:47 on Sunday night, my phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, listening to the sound of the house settling around me, the way old houses do in March when the temperature drops after midnight. The number on the screen wasn't one I recognized. I answered anyway. "Mr. Bennett." The voice was measured and careful, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering information in controlled doses. "My name is Thomas Whitaker. I'm the director of the Special Economic Investigation Unit at the New York State Attorney General's office. I apologize for the hour." I sat up straighter. I knew that name. Thomas Whitaker had presented at 2 federal audit conferences I'd attended in the past decade, a precise, unhurried man with a reputation for cases that held up in court long after everyone else had moved on to the next thing. "Mr. Whitaker," I said carefully, keeping my voice low, "what can I do for you?" "We've recovered some items that belong to your wife," he said. "I need you to come and see them tonight if you're able. Not tomorrow. Tonight." My grip tightened on the phone. "Where?" He gave me an address on the south end of downtown Albany, then added, "Mr. Bennett, please don't use your regular vehicle, and don't tell your daughter where you're going." A pause that felt deliberately weighted. Eleanor prepared for this situation. You need to do exactly what she arranged. The line went quiet after that, but I stayed on the phone an extra few seconds, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I was certain the sound of it would carry down the hallway to where Daniel and Rachel were sleeping. Or not sleeping. I dressed in the dark. I left my phone on the kitchen counter if Daniel's company had remote access to the camera system. I wasn't willing to bet they couldn't track a cell signal, and I walked 3 houses down the block and knocked on Carol Hutchins's door. She answered in her bathrobe, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. That was the thing about Carol. She had known Eleanor for 11 years, and knowing Eleanor meant understanding that some things didn't require explanation. "I need to borrow your car," I said. "I'll have it back by morning." "Keys are on the hook by the garage door," she said. "Walter." She reached out and put her hand on my arm, and her eyes were bright with the particular worry of a woman who already suspects the worst and is hoping to be wrong. "Be careful." I drove Carol's 10-year-old Subaru through streets that were empty and slick with cold rain, taking a route that added 7 minutes to the trip because it avoided the main corridors where my regular commute would have taken me. 3 blocks from home, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. They stayed there. I turned right at the next intersection, then right again, then right a third time, a loop that served no navigational purpose whatsoever. The headlights made every turn. A black SUV. No plates visible in the dark and the rain. My mouth went dry. I pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel to stop them from shaking, took a breath that tasted like fear and cold coffee, and kept driving. Whoever was in that vehicle wasn't hiding the fact that they were following me. That meant they either didn't care if I knew or they wanted me to know. Neither option was comforting. The SUV stopped at the corner of the block, where Thomas's address was located, and didn't follow me into the narrow service road alongside the building. I parked Carol's Subaru and sat for a moment with the engine off, watching the rearview mirror until I was certain nothing else was moving. A door opened at the side of the building. A man I didn't recognize leaned out. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly. "She's been waiting." The man led me down 2 flights of concrete stairs without saying another word. The stairwell smelled like old paper and standing water, and the particular staleness of air that hasn't moved in years. The fluorescent light above the second landing buzzed and flickered with the rhythm of something about to give out entirely. My footsteps echoed off the walls in a way that made me feel exposed, too loud, too present, too easy to locate. At the bottom, a corridor. At the end of the corridor, a door with light bleeding underneath it. The man pushed it open and stepped aside. The room was small and deliberately plain. A steel table, 4 metal chairs, a single overhead light that cast everything in the flat, shadowless brightness of a space designed for functionality rather than comfort. Thomas Whitaker stood near the far wall with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that I recognized from men who have been carrying a difficult thing for a long time and are finally within reach of setting it down. And standing at the near end of the table, with her hands resting on the back of a chair and her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that hit me like a physical force, was a woman I had watched being lowered into the ground 3 years ago. My legs stopped working. I grabbed the doorframe with one hand, my knuckles going white, my breath leaving my body in a single hard rush that didn't come back for what felt like a very long time. The woman didn't move. She stood there and let me look at her, let me work through the arithmetic of what I was seeing. Let me get to the other side of it on my own. "Margaret," I said. The word came out broken in the middle, cracked clean through. "Margaret Cole." "Hello, Walter." Her voice was the same that measured careful cadence I remembered from a dozen dinners at our kitchen table, from Eleanor's birthday parties, from the phone calls that used to come on Sunday afternoons, when the two of them would talk for an hour about nothing and everything. "I know this is a shock. I need you to sit down. You're dead." My voice cracked on the last word, embarrassing me, and I didn't care. "We went to your funeral. Eleanor cried for a week. She kept your photograph on her desk for 3 years, and every time I walked past it, I thought about how much she missed you, and now you're standing here telling me to sit down. Walter." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Please." My legs carried me to the nearest chair, because they had apparently decided to function again, without consulting the rest of me. I sat down hard and pressed both palms flat on the steel table and focused on the cold solidity of it until my breathing evened out. Margaret sat across from me. Up close, she looked older than I remembered, 3 years older at minimum, but also older in the particular way of people who have been living under a sustained, unrelenting pressure. There were new lines around her eyes. Her hair was shorter. She held herself with the careful stillness of someone who has spent years practicing the art of not being noticed. 3 years ago, she said, I discovered a network that was selling advance access to state government data, investment decisions, infrastructure contracts, regulatory actions before they were announced. Her voice was steady, but her hands on the table were not. They pressed against the surface with a rigidity that told me she was holding herself together through effort rather than ease. 2 people who helped me document it had accidents within 6 weeks of each other. One recovered, one didn't. So you ran, I said. I disappeared, she corrected. There's a difference. Running is panic. What I did was calculated. She met my eyes. Thomas's unit helped me stage the fire. A new identity. A location nobody connected to Margaret Cole. It was the only way to stay alive long enough to finish what I'd started. And Eleanor? My throat ached around her name. Eleanor knew. Margaret's expression shifted, something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She found out 8 months after my death. I reached out to her because I needed someone with her skills, someone who could read financial documents the way most people read newspapers, and someone I trusted completely. She paused. I'm sorry, Walter. I know how this sounds. It sounds, I said, my voice coming out harder than I intended, like my wife spent the last 2 years of her life involved in something dangerous, without telling me a single word about it. She didn't tell you because she knew you'd try to protect her. Margaret leaned forward, and her eyes were bright with something fierce and exhausted all at once. And she didn't tell Thomas directly, because she suspected someone inside his unit had been compromised. She needed the evidence to be airtight before it touched anyone she couldn't fully trust. I looked at Thomas. He didn't flinch. Was she right? I asked him. About someone in your unit. Thomas held my gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. She was. The word landed in my chest like something with weight and corners. Eleanor had known. She had known there was a leak had worked around. It had built her case in secret and in silence, and had apparently gotten close enough to the truth that someone had decided she needed to be stopped before she reached it. My hands curled into fists on the table. My jaw ached from clenching it. "Show me," I said. "Show me what she found." Margaret reached for the metal box on the table behind her, small, brass-cornered, the kind of thing that looked like it had been chosen specifically because it looked unremarkable. She set it between us and looked at me with the careful steadiness of a woman delivering something she knows cannot be taken back. "Eleanor left this for you," she said. "She told me if you were sitting in this room, it meant she hadn't made it in time." The box opened with the small brass key Margaret produced from her jacket pocket. Inside, a USB drive, a photograph, a folded sheet of paper covered in Eleanor's handwriting, and a notebook with a blue cover so worn at the corners that I knew without being told she had been carrying it for months. My chest tightened so sharply, it felt like something structural had given way. I reached for the notebook, and Margaret put her hand over mine, not stopping me, just slowing me down. "Let me explain it first," she said. "Eleanor's system takes some translation." Eleanor had developed the notation herself, a combination of abbreviations, date codes, and what looked at first glance like random quotations from books she'd read. Margaret had the key memorized. She opened the notebook to the first marked page and began to walk me through it, her finger moving along the cramped, careful lines of my wife's handwriting, and within 10 minutes I understood what I was looking at. Hundreds of transactions. Cross-data solutions. Daniel's company appearing in the margins of major state decisions with a regularity that no legitimate business relationship could explain. A land rezoning in Syracuse. An infrastructure contract awarded in Buffalo. A regulatory investigation that had been quietly shelved 3 weeks before it would have named 2 companies Daniel's firm consulted for. Every single entry preceded the official government announcement by between 4 and 11 days. "Someone was feeding Daniel advance information," I said. My voice came out flat and stripped of everything except the fact itself. "He was trading on it. Selling it," Margaret corrected. "To private investment groups. To foreign interests. Wire fraud securities, fraud insider trading, under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. She said the statute numbers the way Eleanor used to cite them automatically, without emphasis, the way you recite an address you've known for years. The money went out through shell companies and sports betting platforms, clean on the other end. Thomas spoke from this corner. "We estimate the total transactions at somewhere north of $200 million over 4 years. The number sat in the room like something with physical mass. "But the person feeding Daniel the information," I said slowly, "isn't Daniel. He doesn't have that kind of access. He runs a data analytics firm. He processes what agencies give him. He doesn't generate it himself." "No," Thomas agreed. "He doesn't." Margaret opened the photograph. It showed Daniel in a parking garage underground. Concrete pillars, the kind of anonymous space designed specifically to not be remembered. He was talking to a man whose face was partially obscured by the angle of the shot, but whose build and silver hair were familiar enough to make my stomach drop 6 inches. The second photograph was worse. Rachel. Standing outside a coffee shop on what I recognized as a midtown Manhattan block, passing a manila envelope to a man I didn't know. She was wearing the burgundy coat I had given her for her 35th birthday. She looked focused and deliberate and not even slightly like a woman who was doing something she hadn't chosen. "Eleanor didn't just suspect Daniel," Margaret said, and her voice dropped into a gentleness that I recognized as the kind people use when they're about to say something they wish they didn't have to. She believed Rachel was managing the financial records for the entire network. Not a victim. Not someone who was coerced. She paused. A participant who understood exactly what she was participating in. The burgundy coat. Her 35th birthday. She had hugged me in the restaurant parking lot, and said it was the most beautiful thing she owned. My throat closed completely. My eyes burned so badly I had to press the heel of my hand against them hard until the burning became something I could categorize as physical rather than the other thing, the thing I wasn't ready to name yet, because naming it would make it permanent. Walter. Margaret's voice was careful. I'm sorry. Don't, I said. The word came out rougher than I intended. I lowered my hand. My vision was blurry at the edges, but I kept my eyes open, kept them on the photograph, made myself look at my daughter's face in that image until I could do it without my hands shaking. It took longer than I wanted it to. Show me everything else, I said finally. All of it. Thomas spread the financial diagram across the steel table. It wasn't a map in any geographical sense. It was a network, dozens of company names connected by arrows, some thick and direct, some thin and looping through 3 or 4 intermediate nodes before reaching their destination. I had spent 29 years reading budget documents, and even so it took me a full minute to understand what I was looking at, which told me something about how deliberately it had been constructed to resist understanding. Walk me through it, I said. Thomas pulled a chair around to my side of the table and sat down, which I took as a sign that what he was about to say was going to take a while. The network doesn't steal money directly from the state budget, he said. That's what makes it difficult to prosecute under conventional fraud statutes. What it steals is information, advanced knowledge of government decisions before those decisions become public. He pointed to a cluster of names in the upper left of the diagram. These are the end buyers. Private investment groups, mostly domestic too, with foreign ties, we're still tracing. They pay for early access to state data, which contracts are going to be awarded, which land parcels are going to be rezoned, which companies are about to come under regulatory scrutiny. He moved his finger to the center of the diagram. Cross Data Solutions sits here. Daniel receives the information, packages it, and sells it through this layer. His finger traced a web of arrows leading outward. Shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. A pair of investment funds incorporated in the Cayman Islands. And here, he tapped a node near the bottom, a sports betting platform operating out of New Jersey. The betting platform is the laundry, I said. Thomas looked at me with something that might have been mild surprise. Exactly. The platform runs accounts that place bets on predetermined outcomes, wins and losses scripted in advance. Dirty money goes in as wagers comes out as gambling winnings. Clean on paper, fully taxable, no obvious connection to a state government information leak. He paused. Under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956, that's money laundering in its clearest form. Under Section 1343, every electronic transmission of non-public government data is a separate count of wire fraud. We're looking at potentially hundreds of individual charges. I pressed my fingers against my forehead so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. $200 million. Hundreds of counts. And Daniel Cross had been sitting at my kitchen table for the past 3 days, fixing my guest bathroom faucet and asking Rachel what she wanted for dinner. But Daniel doesn't generate the information himself, I said, because I needed to say it out loud to make sure I was still thinking straight. He processes data that agencies give him under contract. He can't access inspection schedules or unreleased budget decisions on his own. Someone inside the system is feeding it to him. Yes, Thomas said. Someone with my level of clearance, or higher. Yes. Margaret had been quiet through all of this, sitting across the table with her hands folded and her eyes on my face, watching me work through it, the way Eleanor used to watch me read a difficult document, not rushing me, just present. How long? I asked. At least 6 years, Thomas said. Possibly longer. The earliest transaction Eleanor flagged in the notebook dates to the spring of 2019. Spring of 2019. Rachel's failed project in San Francisco. Her financial trouble. Daniel appearing with a solution that probably hadn't sounded like what it was when he first presented it to her. "The person at the top," I said. "You have a list." Thomas reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. 7 names, people within the New York State government apparatus, with sufficient access to the data that had been leaking. Budget directors, deputy commissioners, 2 people from the governor's policy office. I read the list from top to bottom. Then I read it again, more slowly, because I wanted to be certain I wasn't manufacturing a connection that wasn't there. I wasn't. The 4th name on the list made my chest feel like something had reached inside it and closed a fist around everything that kept me upright. I set the paper down on the table with a care that had nothing to do with the paper, and everything to do with the fact that my hands had started shaking again, and I did not want Thomas or Margaret to see it. "Walter," Margaret said quietly. Her voice was the voice of a woman who already knew what name I'd just read. "Are you all right?" "No," I said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "But I will be." I straightened in my chair, pressed both palms flat on the table until the shaking stopped. "Tell me how we prove it." Thomas reached back into the folder and produced a second set of documents, thicker than the first, bound with a binder clip that he removed with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this particular reveal many times before. He set the stack in front of me. The first page had my name on it, not in the way my name appeared on a budget memo or an interdepartmental filing. My name on a corporate registration document, Walter R. Bennett, listed as the managing director of a consulting firm called Aldgate Advisory Group, LLC, registered in Delaware in March of 2022. I had never heard of Aldgate Advisory Group. "Keep reading," Thomas said. I turned the page. Another registration, Bennett Capital Partners, LLC, Nevada, September 2021. Then a third. Strategic Consulting, Delaware, June 2020. My name on every one. My social security number. My home address. On 2 of the documents, a signature that looked enough like mine to pass a casual review, the particular slant of the capital W, the way my R ran slightly into the B details, that only someone who had studied my handwriting at close range over a sustained period of time could have replicated with that degree of accuracy. My jaw tightened until my back teeth ached. "There are also 2 investment funds," Thomas continued, "incorporated in the Cayman Islands, with your name listed as a beneficial owner, and 17 individual brokerage accounts opened at 4 different financial institutions, all using your social security number and a variation of your signature." He paused. "Under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, each account represents a separate count of identity theft. Under New York Penal Law Section 170.10, the forged signatures constitute first-degree forgery, a Class C felony. How many transactions ran through these accounts?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, which was the only thing about the situation I had any control over. Across all entities, approximately $83 million over 4 years. $83 million. Moving through companies and accounts bearing my name, my signature, my social security number. If the investigation had surfaced 6 months ago, without any of what Margaret and Thomas now had, I would have walked into a federal courtroom as the primary defendant with no explanation for any of it. That didn't sound like exactly the kind of thing a guilty man would say. "Rachel helped me file my taxes for 3 consecutive years," I said. "She asked to help. Said it gave her something to focus on after a difficult stretch at work." I pressed my hand flat against the table because it had started shaking again, and I refused to let it. She had access to everything, every document, every number. Yes, Margaret said. Her voice was careful. And Daniel controls your home security system. Between the two of them, they've had everything they needed for years. Eleanor found out how, I asked. Thomas leaned forward. About 14 months ago, Eleanor was helping Rachel organize some files. Rachel had asked her to look over some documents related to a property purchase. Eleanor noticed a power of attorney form mixed in with the papers. It had your signature on it. He met my eyes. She recognized it wasn't yours. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Eleanor had been sitting at Rachel's kitchen table looking through real estate documents, and she had seen my signature on a form I had never signed. She hadn't said a word. She had gone home and opened a blue notebook and started writing things down in a code only she and Margaret could read. And she had spent the next 14 months building a case so careful and so complete that it would hold up in any court in the country. She had done all of that without once letting me see that anything was wrong. My eyes burned. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth and held them there until the burning subsided enough to be manageable. She could have told me, I said. She was protecting you, Margaret said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, which told me she had said some version of this to herself many times over the past 2 years, and still hadn't fully made peace with it. Thomas cleared his throat. There's someone I want you to speak with. Arthur Brennan, he's a private estates attorney now, but he spent 18 years as a federal prosecutor before he retired. He's reviewed the forged documents and can testify to their inauthenticity in court. He's also an old friend of yours, I understand. 30 years, I said. We went to Albany Law together. Good. Thomas gathered the documents back into the folder with the same practiced efficiency he'd shown throughout, which I was beginning to understand was his way of signaling that a chapter was closing and another was about to open. Because here's the problem, Mr. Bennett. Right now, without the full case assembled and presented properly, you are the most credible suspect in a federal fraud investigation involving your own name on $83 million in transactions. He held my gaze. Which means from this point forward, everything depends on how well you can pretend you don't know any of this. I looked at him across the table. I've been reviewing fraudulent documents for 29 years, I said. I know how to keep my face neutral. This is different, Thomas said quietly. These people are inside your house. He was right. I knew he was right. And the particular fear that moved through me when he said it, not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slow, cold fear of sustained deception among people I had loved, was something I understood I was going to have to learn to carry the way you carry a chronic injury, carefully, without letting it change your gait. Tell me what I need to do, I said. Before I show you what Eleanor left behind in that video, the one she recorded alone in her car 3 hours before everything changed, I need to know if you're still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. That's all. Just 9 so I know you're here and you're ready for what comes next. Because what she said in those final minutes changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. A reminder, some elements of this story have been shaped for narrative purposes. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, this is a good moment to step away, no hard feelings. But if you're staying, I'm glad. You'll want to hear this. Margaret reached into the metal box one final time and produced a USB drive. Small, silver, unremarkable, the kind of thing you could buy at any drugstore in America. She held it out to me without speaking, and the look on her face was the look of someone handing over something they have been entrusted with for a long time and are only now finally able to release. She recorded this 6 weeks before the accident, Margaret said. She made me promise to show it to you in person, not to send it, not to describe it. She paused. She wanted you to hear it from her. Thomas connected the drive to a laptop on the side table and angled the screen toward me. Then he and Margaret both moved to the far end of the room without being asked, which told me Eleanor had anticipated this moment with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. The screen went dark. Then it filled with her face. My breath left my body. Eleanor was sitting in the driver's seat of our Volvo. I knew it from the particular gray of the interior, the small crack in the dashboard above the climate controls that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. The light coming through the windshield was early morning light, pale and flat, the kind that made everything look like it was still deciding whether the day was worth the effort. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, but her eyes were clear, and when she looked into the camera, she looked at it the way she always looked at me, like there was nobody else in the world worth the full attention of her gaze. Walter. Her voice. Her actual voice filling that small concrete room, and I pressed my fist against my sternum because the pressure of hearing it was almost more than I could absorb without making a sound I didn't want Thomas and Margaret to hear. If you're watching this, then I didn't make it, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I'm about to tell you, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, and I need you to understand that every decision I made was because I was trying to protect you, not because I didn't trust you. She shifted slightly in her seat. Outside the windshield, I could see the pale outlines of a parking structure. Somewhere she had gone specifically to record this, somewhere away from the house, away from any device Daniel might have had eyes on. Rachel got into trouble in 2019, she said. The San Francisco project collapsed. She owed more than $400,000, and she was too ashamed to tell us. Her voice held steady, but something at the corners of her eyes tightened in a way I recognized as the expression she made when she was talking about something that caused her physical pain. Daniel came to her with what he described as a simple arrangement. She would provide him with a few unreleased reports, public data that just hadn't been announced yet. One time. Enough to cover the debt. Eleanor looked down for a moment, then back up. It wasn't one time, she said. And it wasn't simple. And by the time Rachel understood what she was actually involved in, she had made enough decisions to make walking away feel impossible. A long breath. I want to be honest with you, Walter, because I owe you that. Daniel opened the door, but our daughter walked through it herself. She didn't just participate, she took control of the financial records because she understood that being indispensable was the only protection she had. My throat had closed so completely I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. I sat with my hands pressed flat against my thighs and let my wife's voice fill the room, and tried to hold myself together with nothing but the chair underneath me and the table in front of me. And 37 years of knowing that Eleanor had never once told me something she didn't believe to be absolutely true. The man feeding information to Daniel has access to the same systems you do, Eleanor continued. Maybe higher. I don't know who he is yet, I'm close, but I'm not there. Which is why I'm recording this instead of walking into Thomas's office. If there's a leak in his unit and I show up with an incomplete case, everything disappears. She leaned slightly closer to the camera. The blue notebook has what I've confirmed. The black notebook has the rest, the full map. You'll know where to find it. Only you will know. She stopped, pressed her lips together. And when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something quieter and more private. The voice she used late at night, when it was just the two of us, and there was nothing left to perform for anyone. You are the most honest person I have ever known, she said. That is not a small thing. In the world we've been living in for the past 4 years, that is an extraordinary thing. They chose you to take the blame because honest people don't expect to be framed. They assume the system will sort it out. A pause. Don't assume that. Fight back. Fight back the way I know you can, quietly, carefully, and completely." The screen held her face for another 3 seconds. Then it went dark. The room felt enormous and airless all at once, the way a room feels after a sound has stopped, that you hadn't realized you were depending on to orient yourself. I sat absolutely still, my fist still pressed against my chest, feeling my own heartbeat knock against my knuckles in a rhythm that seemed too loud for the silence around it. "Walter," Margaret's voice from the far end of the room, careful and low. "Take whatever time you need." "I'm all right," I said. It wasn't true, but it was what Eleanor would have expected me to say, and saying it made me feel for just a moment like she was still close enough to hear it. I looked at Thomas. "She recorded this 3 hours before the accident," I said. "She knew she was driving into something dangerous." "Yes," Thomas said. "We believe she did." I nodded once. My jaw ached. My eyes felt scraped raw. But underneath all of it, underneath the grief and the rage and the specific devastation of hearing my wife's voice tell me our daughter had chosen this, underneath all of it, something had settled into place with the quiet finality of a bolt sliding home. "She left me a black notebook," I said, "and she said only I would know where to find it." I looked at Thomas. "I think I know where. But first tell me exactly what happened to her car." Thomas made a phone call while Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos on the side table and set one in front of me without asking whether I wanted it. I didn't want it. I drank it anyway because my hands needed something to do. The laptop screen came back to life this time, showing a video call. A man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular look of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was running on professional obligation rather than energy. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas said, "this is Dr. James Okafor. He's the senior forensic pathologist at Albany Medical Center and one of the leading accident reconstruction specialists in the state." Dr. Okafor nodded at the screen. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry for your loss. I'll be direct because I think that's what you need right now." "Please," I said. He opened a folder in front of him and turned it toward the camera. "The initial accident report attributed your wife's loss of vehicle control to wet road conditions. Standard finding for that stretch of the I-787 in March." He paused. "It was wrong." My grip tightened around the coffee cup. "We recovered the vehicle's ECU, the engine control unit, essentially the car's onboard computer," he continued. "The data shows a sudden catastrophic drop in brake fluid pressure approximately 90 seconds before the crash. Not gradual. Not the kind of pressure loss you'd see from a slow leak or normal wear." He looked directly into the camera. "This was an abrupt failure consistent with deliberate interference with the braking system. Under New York Penal Law Section 190.72, that constitutes criminal tampering with a vehicle." "Someone cut the brake line," I said. "Compromised it," Dr. Okafor said carefully. "In a way designed to fail under sustained braking pressure, the kind of pressure a driver would apply when a car begins to drift on a wet road. The failure would look to any first responder exactly like a mechanical malfunction." I set the coffee cup down before I crushed it. "The maintenance records," Thomas added, "were altered in the dealership's electronic system after Eleanor's death. Someone accessed the service database remotely and deleted the entry from her last inspection, the inspection that would have shown the braking system was in perfect working order 48 hours before the crash. The car that followed her," I said, "on I-787. Traffic cameras on that corridor captured a vehicle approximately 4 car lengths behind Eleanor's Volvo for the 11 minutes preceding the accident. The rear license plate was obscured with a retro-reflective material invisible to cameras, but not to the naked eye at close range." Thomas's voice was steady and measured. "The vehicle belongs to a private security firm that has received 3 contracts from Cross-Data Solutions in the past 2 years. The words arranged themselves in my mind with the terrible clarity of a financial discrepancy that suddenly makes every other number in the ledger make sense. Daniel hadn't just been in my house for 3 days, going through Eleanor's study. He had been in this from the beginning: the brake line, the maintenance records, the car that followed her down the highway. And under New York Penal Law Section 125.25, murder in the second degree covers exactly this: causing a person's death through deliberate action, regardless of whether you're present at the scene. "I need to go home and confront my daughter," I said. My voice came out raw and scraped clean of everything except the need to move, to act, to do something with the rage that was pressing against the inside of my ribs, like something trying to get out. "No!" Margaret's voice was sharp, sharper than I'd heard from her all night. She leaned across the table and her eyes were fierce and exhausted and absolutely certain. "Walter, if Rachel knows we have the notebook, she activates whatever exit plan she's built for herself. She disappears. Daniel disappears. Everything Eleanor spent 2 years building disappears with them. So what do I do?" The words came out harder than I intended, cracking at the edges. "You go home," Thomas said quietly. "You walk in that door, and you are a grieving man who knows nothing. You let them believe they have already won." He held my gaze. "Eleanor drove to your office building that morning because she believed her phone and her house were both compromised. She was trying to reach you through the one channel they hadn't closed." His voice dropped. "The least we can do is finish what she started." The rage didn't go away. It settled the way hot metal settles when it cools, harder and denser and more permanent than it was before. "All right," I said. "Tell me exactly how this works." I drove home in the gray before dawn and practiced in the car. Not out loud, just in my head, running through the version of myself I was going to need to be when I walked through that front door. A man undone by grief. A man who had stopped sleeping properly and couldn't remember whether he'd eaten. A man who needed his daughter to take care of things because the weight of ordinary decisions had become temporarily more than he could carry. I had spent 29 years keeping my face neutral in rooms where money was missing, and someone at the table was responsible for it. I told myself this was the same skill. I told myself it wasn't different at all. I almost believed it. Rachel was already awake when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug, still in her pajamas. She looked up when I came in, and her face collapsed with relief and worry in equal measure. "Dad, where were you? I checked your room at 3 in the morning, and you weren't there. I didn't know whether to call someone." "I'm sorry, sweetheart." I let my voice come out tired, which wasn't difficult because I was tired down to the marrow. "I couldn't sleep. I drove around for a while. Old habit." She crossed the room and put her arms around me, and I held her, and felt the particular agony of embracing someone you love and are simultaneously building a case against. Her hair smelled like Eleanor's shampoo. She must have used whatever was left in the guest bathroom, and the grief that moved through me in that moment was entirely real. "You scared me," she whispered against my shoulder. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." Daniel appeared in the doorway, in a gray t-shirt, reading the room with the speed of a man who had learned to calibrate his responses to whatever the situation required. "Walter, you all right?" "Getting there," I said. Carol Hutchins knocked on the front door at 10 that morning with a coffee cake and the particular determined cheerfulness of a woman who processes worry by feeding people. I let her in, and while Rachel took her coat, and Daniel made fresh coffee, and the 3 of them stood in the kitchen talking about Eleanor, a young man named Kevin Barnes, Thomas's technical specialist, 30 minutes ahead of schedule, slipped through the side gate I had left unlatched and let himself into the garage. He was in and out in 11 minutes. When he left, there was a small listening device fitted inside the casing of the clock on the living room wall, and a second one behind the baseboard in the hallway outside the guest room. I knew this because Thomas had shown me exactly what they looked like and exactly where they would go. I did not look at either of them. That afternoon, Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table and slid a folder across the surface with the careful casualness of someone who has been planning the gesture for longer than they want you to know. "Dad, I've been thinking. With everything that happened, there's some paperwork that needs updating. Bank accounts, the investment portfolio, Mom handled most of it, and now that she's gone, someone needs to have proper access in case something comes up while you're not feeling your best." She opened the folder. "It's just a standard power of attorney. It lets me step in and manage things temporarily so you don't have to worry about it." A notary arrived 40 minutes later, a young man Daniel introduced as a colleague who owed him a favor and witnessed me sign a document that Thomas's team had substituted 3 days earlier. The signatures matched precisely. The document was worthless. That evening, while I pretended to doze in the armchair in the living room, Rachel stepped into the hallway and made a call. Her voice was low and careful, but the device behind the baseboard had no trouble with it. "He signed," she said. "Everything's in place." The voice on the other end was unhurried and familiar, and hearing it in this context from the hallway of the house I had shared with Eleanor for 22 years, spoken by my daughter into a phone she thought nobody could hear, felt like watching something break in slow motion, each piece separating cleanly from the whole before the whole was gone. It was Harold Vance. At 2 in the morning, the clock on the living room wall recorded Rachel moving through the house in the dark, opening the door to Eleanor's study, working methodically through the shelves, while Daniel stood just outside in the hallway, his back against the wall watching the corridor. They were looking for something that wasn't there. I lay in my bed 3 rooms away and stared at the ceiling and thought about Eleanor, who had known they would come looking and had made sure there was nothing left to find. Eleanor and I had walked around Washington Park every Sunday morning for 15 years. Not every Sunday, without exception. There were winters when the ice made it foolish, and the years when Rachel was small and needed one of us to stay home, and the months I spent reviewing a particularly brutal infrastructure audit that had me working 7 days a week from October through February. But most Sundays, enough Sundays that the path around the lake had grooves in my memory, the way a familiar route gets grooves in a dirt trail worn smooth by repetition, until you could walk it in the dark without thinking. I told Rachel I needed air. She offered to come with Mung, and I saw the calculation behind the offer. Not malicious, just watchful, and I shook my head and said I needed to be alone with my thoughts for a while. She accepted that. Daniel looked up from his laptop when I passed through the living room, but said nothing. The park was quiet in the early morning, the lake flat and gray under a sky that hadn't decided what it wanted to do yet. I walked the perimeter at the pace of a man with nowhere particular to be nodding at the 2 other early walkers I passed, stopping once to watch a pair of geese argue over a piece of bread someone had left on the bank. The wooden bridge on the northeast side of the lake was old. The Parks Department had been discussing replacing it for at least 3 years without doing anything about it. Eleanor used to cross it every week and say with the particular patience of a woman who had spent her career documenting things that should have been fixed and weren't, "Someone is going to fall through that bridge, Walter, and then they'll replace it." The third plank from the east end had a section of railing that had been loose for as long as I could remember. I had mentioned it to Eleanor once years ago, suggesting we call the Parks Department. She had looked at the railing thoughtfully and said, "Not yet. It's not dangerous, just loose." I understood now why she had wanted it to stay that way. I crouched beside the railing and felt along the underside of the third plank with my fingers. The waterproof bag was exactly where she had left it, secured to the support beam, with a zip tie small enough that you would never find it unless you knew precisely where to look and were willing to get your knees dirty to do it. Inside, Eleanor's phone connected to a thin backup battery that had kept it alive, and a small brass key on a paper tag that read in Eleanor's handwriting, Albany Central Post Office. Box 447. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the phone down on the plank and press them flat against my thighs for a moment before I could trust myself to handle it properly. Kevin Barnes was waiting near the park entrance far enough away to be unobtrusive, close enough to respond if needed. I carried the phone to him and watched him work through it with the fast, economical efficiency of someone who did this for a living. Within 20 minutes, he had found what Eleanor had left there to be found. An audio recording. 43 minutes long. Eleanor's voice and Rachel's voice recorded in what sounded like a car, the ambient road noise underneath the particular acoustics of a sealed space. Kevin handed me one earbud. I took it. Eleanor's voice came through first steady and careful. Rachel, I need you to stop. I need you to talk to Thomas Whitaker's office and tell them everything you know. I can help you. I will help you, but you have to stop now before this goes any further. A long pause filled with the sound of Rachel breathing in the jagged, effortful way of someone trying not to cry and failing. Then, Mom, you don't understand how far it's already gone. It's not something I can just walk away from. These people, I know who these people are, Eleanor said. That's exactly why we need to move now while there's still. You don't know all of it. Rachel's voice cracked and then steadied itself into something harder and flatter, the voice of a woman who had been making herself hard for a long time. If you hand over that notebook, it won't just be me and Daniel who get hurt. Dad loses everything too. His name is on their paperwork, Mom, all of it. They built it that way on purpose. The breath Eleanor drew was slow and controlled the breath of a woman absorbing a blow without letting it move her. Then we fix that too. Together. But you have to trust me. I do trust you, Rachel said, and her voice broke completely on the last word, dissolving into tears that sounded like they had been waiting a long time to come out. I just don't trust that it's going to be enough. The recording ended there. I stood at the edge of Washington Park with one earbud in and the gray morning light coming across the lake, and I pressed my free hand over my mouth because the sound that wanted to come out of me was not one I was willing to make in a public place. My daughter had been sitting in a car with her mother crying, telling her she was trapped, and Eleanor had been trying to reach her, and neither of them had called me. Neither of them had thought I could help. Kevin touched my arm gently. There's a draft email on the phone, he said quietly. Addressed to the FBI field office in Albany. Never sent. He paused. And a series of messages from an encrypted account Northbridge, threatening her, telling her that if she contacted law enforcement, the consequences would extend to her entire family. Northbridge, I said. Yes, sir. It's the third time we've seen that name. Kevin looked at me carefully. Do you want me to call Mr. Whitaker? No, I said. I think I already know who it is, but I need to be certain. I looked at the brass key in my hand, box 447, Albany Central Post Office, Eleanor's handwriting on the tag. And I need to get to the post office before it opens. Albany Central Post Office opened at 8:30. I was waiting outside at 8:15 with the brass key in my coat pocket, and Kevin Barnes standing 20 feet away pretending to check his phone. The morning was cold enough that my breath came out in small clouds, and I stood there watching them dissipate and thinking about Eleanor, who had walked into this building at some point in the past 14 months, rented a box under what name I didn't know, and placed inside it the one thing she didn't trust any other location to hold. Box 447 was in the back row, third from the bottom. The key fit on the first try. Inside was a single black notebook, thicker than the blue one, its cover creased in the way of something that had been opened and closed hundreds of times. I held it for a moment, before I opened it, just held it, because it was the last physical thing Eleanor had made with her hands that I hadn't yet seen, and once I opened it, there would be nothing left. Then I opened it. Her handwriting filled every page. Not the coded system she'd used in the blue notebook. This was plain English, organized with the meticulous clarity of a woman who had spent 30 years producing documents that had to hold up under scrutiny. Account numbers, transfer dates, company names cross-referenced against government decision logs, and at the center of every page, anchoring the whole structure, like a load-bearing wall, a single account identifier she had circled in red ink. Northbridge Capital Management, LLC, registered in Delaware. Listed director, a name I didn't recognize. But the registered agent address, a law office on State Street in Albany, was 3 blocks from the Alfred E. Smith building. 3 blocks from where Harold Vance had his office. Kevin spread his own analysis across the table in Thomas's temporary workspace. 2 hours later, a network diagram that looked almost identical to the one Thomas had shown me a week ago, except this one had a name in the center box instead of a question mark. Every instruction Rachel and Daniel received traces back to this account. Kevin said, his finger moving across the diagram with the focused efficiency of someone in their element. Northbridge sends encrypted directives when to sell which official, to approach which data package to prepare. Rachel confirms receipt. Daniel executes. He looked up. Northbridge never touches the transactions directly. Clean separation between the source and the movement of money. Classic insulation, I said. 29 years of audit work, and I recognized the architecture immediately, the same structure a savvy embezzler uses to keep their fingerprints off the actual theft. The person at the top stays clean on paper, while everyone below them carries the legal exposure. Yes, Kevin said. And 6 years ago, someone in a senior position at your office recommended that the state sign a data-sharing agreement with Cross-Data Solutions. He slid a document across the table. The recommendation memo is signed by the Deputy First Director. Harold Vance's signature. The same signature I had seen on 1,000 interdepartmental memos. The same man who had stood at Eleanor's funeral, with both hands extended, and told me she was extraordinary. My stomach turned over so violently, I had to press my hand flat against the table. Thomas watched me read and didn't say anything, which I appreciated more than I could have articulated. He introduced Daniel to me once, I said, 4 years ago. A retirement party for someone in the governor's policy office. I remember thinking it was strange that Harold knew him. I looked up. I thought it was strange, and then I forgot about it because Harold knew everyone. That was Harold, he always knew everyone. Yes, Thomas said quietly. That's exactly what made him useful. Margaret spoke from the corner she had been listening without interrupting, which was her way. Eleanor had the same memo, Walter. It's in the black notebook, page 47. She found it 8 months ago, and that's when she understood who was at the top. I turned to page 47. Eleanor had written 2 words in the margin beside Harold's signature, in ink pressed harder than anything else on the page. The kind of pressure you use when you are trying to make something true by the sheer force of writing it down 22 years. My throat closed around something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but was made of both in equal measure, heated together until they became something new and harder than either one alone. Tell me how we test him, I said, without letting him know we're testing. Thomas nodded slowly. We have a plan, but it has to come from you. Before I tell you the name of the person who orchestrated all of it, the person who sat across from me at lunch every Wednesday for 22 years, I want you to make a guess. Type, I know, if you've already figured it out. Type, no idea, if you haven't. Because when I saw that name on the list, my hands started shaking, and I don't shake easily. Just a reminder, this story includes fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. Names and circumstances are not drawn from any single real event, but the lesson inside is entirely genuine. If this isn't the right story for you, you're always welcome to step away. For everyone still here, let's finish this together. The plan was Thomas's, but the execution had to be mine. That was the part that kept me awake the night before. Not the mechanics of it, which were straightforward enough, but the fact that I was going to sit across a desk from a man I had eaten lunch with every Wednesday for 22 years and lie to his face while wearing a recording device the size of a shirt button. I had built my entire career on the premise that I didn't do that kind of thing. I was the man who flagged the discrepancy when everyone else in the room was pretending not to see it. I was the man Harold had called more times than I could count the most honest person in the building. I drove to the Alfred E. Smith building on the morning of the 29th and took the elevator to the 16th floor and walked down the corridor, past offices I had walked past 10,000 times, and I knocked on Harold Vance's open door the way I had knocked on it 100 times before. 2 knuckles easy, the knock of a man who belongs. Harold looked up from his desk, and his face did exactly what I needed it to do, opened with the warm, unreserved pleasure of a man genuinely glad to see his oldest friend. Walter. He was on his feet before I reached the chair, crossing the room with both arms extended, gripping my shoulders. Come in, sit down. God, it's good to see you out of that house." He steered me toward the chair across from his desk, with the practiced solicitude of a man who knew exactly how to make people feel cared for. "How are you holding up? And I mean really not the answer you give people in the hallway." "Some days better than others," I said, which was true enough to say without feeling like I was lying. "Rachel and Daniel have been staying with me. It helps." "Good." Harold settled back into his own chair, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk, his expression arranged into the open, attentive configuration he used when he wanted someone to know he was fully present. "They're good people. You're lucky to have them." I let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "Harold," I said, dropping my voice slightly, as though what I was about to say was the kind of thing that needed a smaller space around it. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I got a call yesterday from Jim Paulson over at the regulatory division. They're opening a quiet internal review on a renewable energy company up in Buffalo Lakeshore Green Energy. Nothing public yet. Shouldn't be public for at least another 3 weeks. Harold's expression didn't change. That was the impressive thing, not a flicker, not a tightening around the eyes, not the smallest involuntary adjustment. 22 years of practice at receiving sensitive information and looking like you haven't. "That's so," he said, in the tone of mild professional interest. "Lakeshore. I don't know them well. Probably nothing," I said. "Jim just wanted me to flag it in case any of our infrastructure reviews touched their contracts." I shook my head with the rueful weariness of a man who finds bureaucratic overlap tiresome. "You know how it is." "I do," Harold said warmly. "I'll keep an eye out." We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. The office restructuring proposal that had been circulating since January, a retirement dinner being planned for someone in the comptroller's division. Harold walked me to the elevator himself and gripped my arm at the door and said with every appearance of sincerity, "Walter, if you need anything, anything at all, you call me first. You hear, I said. I drove directly to Thomas's temporary office and sat down and waited. 12 hours and 17 minutes after I left Harold's office, the trading volume on Lakeshore Green Energy spiked hard. Someone had purchased a significant block of put options, a bet that the stock would fall once the regulatory review became public. The transaction ran through a brokerage account in the Cayman Islands that Kevin had been watching for 3 weeks. The account was registered to Northbridge Capital Management. My phone rang at 4:15 the following afternoon. Harold's name on the screen. I answered on the second ring and kept my voice at the same easy register I always used with him. "Harold, what's up? Just checking in." His voice was warm, unhurried, and completely in control. "I've been thinking about you, Walter, about what you've been through these past few weeks. And I want to say something as your friend, not as a colleague." A pause precisely calibrated to suggest reluctance. Sometimes the best thing a man can do for his reputation, for his family, for everything he's built, is recognize when it's time to step back. To leave on his own terms while he still can. Another pause. Grief does things to a person's judgment. Nobody would blame you for taking early retirement. In fact, I think most people would respect it enormously. The words were smooth and reasonable and wrapped in 30 years of practiced friendship, and underneath every single syllable was a threat so clear I could have framed it and hung it on a wall. "That's very thoughtful, Harold," I said. "I'll give it serious consideration." I ended the call. I sat for a long moment with the phone in my hand, feeling the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from understanding fully and finally the shape of something you had been refusing to look at directly. Then I typed 3 words to Thomas, confirmed. "It's him." Thomas responded in under a minute, "Good. Now go home and keep playing your part. We're almost there." I put the phone in my pocket and looked out the window at the Albany skyline. The same skyline Harold Vance looked at from his office every morning, and thought about 22 years of Wednesday lunches, and the man who had spent all of them sitting across from me smiling and deciding exactly how useful I was going to be. Rachel found the device on a Tuesday. I wasn't home when it happened. I was at Thomas's temporary office going through the black notebook page by page with Kevin, cross-referencing Eleanor's account diagrams against the transaction records Kevin had pulled from 3 separate financial databases. I came home at 6 to find Rachel in the kitchen, making dinner with the focused, deliberate energy of a woman who has decided that chopping vegetables is an acceptable substitute for whatever she actually wants to do with her hands. "You look tired, Dad," she said without turning around. "Sit down. I'll have this ready in 20 minutes. Daniel was on the back porch with his laptop visible through the sliding glass door. He raised a hand when he saw me. I raised one back. I sat at the kitchen table and watched my daughter cook, and thought about Eleanor, who had stood in this same kitchen 10,000 times, and tried to remember the last meal the 4 of us had eaten together before everything became what it was now. What I didn't know, what Thomas told me 2 hours later when I stepped outside under the pretense of checking the mail, was that Rachel had gone into the study that afternoon, moved the lamp to dust underneath it, and found the wire. She had recognized it immediately. Thomas said she didn't react. No sharp intake of breath, no change in posture, nothing that would have registered on the device itself. She simply looked at it for a moment, then stood up and went back to what she had been doing. 20 minutes later, she sat down at the desk and spoke in a clear, unhurried voice. "I burned it," she said. "Mom's notebook. I found it in the back of her closet 2 weeks ago, and I burned it because I was scared. There's nothing left." A pause. "And Daniel. I think Daniel has been moving money without telling me. I've seen transfers I can't account for. I think he's been preparing to leave." Another pause longer. "If someone is listening to this, I want to help. I want to tell you everything I know. But I'm afraid of what Daniel will do if he finds out." Thomas's voice on the phone was carefully neutral. She performed it well. If we hadn't been watching the study camera feed in real time, we might have believed her. "But you didn't," I said. "Margaret noticed. She said the pacing was wrong, too composed, too complete. A woman genuinely breaking under pressure doesn't deliver information in that order. A pause. Walter, Rachel knows we've been watching, and she's not planning to surrender. She's planning to redirect. I stood in the cold dark of the front yard and let that settle into me. Eleanor had said it on the video. She took control because being indispensable was the only protection she had. Rachel wasn't reacting to being caught. She was adapting. She had found a listening device in her mother's study, and within 20 minutes had turned it into a tool feeding us a narrative that pointed suspicion at Daniel, positioned herself as a potential cooperating witness, and gave nothing real away. That night at dinner, she asked me with her mother's eyes and her father's directness whether I had given any more thought to what I wanted to do with Eleanor's study. "I think I want to keep it as it is for a while," I said. She nodded, her expression soft and full of a sympathy that looked entirely genuine. "That makes sense, Dad. There's no rush." Daniel refilled my water glass without being asked and said something about the weather turning warmer by the weekend. And the three of us sat there in the kitchen of the house I had shared with Eleanor for 22 years and had a perfectly ordinary dinner. Later, alone in the bedroom, I called Thomas. "She's not going to crack," I said. "Not on her own." "No," Thomas agreed. "She's going to wait until she thinks she has a better option." He paused. "Which means we need to make sure that when the time comes, she doesn't have one." Through the wall, I could hear Rachel and Daniel's voices, low, indistinct, the sound of two people talking quietly in a room they believed was private. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster and thought about what Margaret had told me after listening to the recording. She's preparing to push both of them under, her husband and her father, and walk away clean. I lay down on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt something that wasn't grief or rage or the cold weight of what I knew. I felt afraid, not of Harold, not of Daniel. Of Rachel, who had found a recording device in her mother's study and turned it into a weapon in under 20 minutes. A woman that precise didn't go into a room like that one without something of her own already in her pocket. I didn't know what she was carrying yet, but I understood lying there in the dark that whatever it was, she had been building it for a long time. Rachel had always kept records of everything, every call, every meeting, every number that passed through her hands. It was the one habit she had inherited directly from her mother, and I suspected she had been using it the same way Eleanor had. Quietly, methodically, against the people she was most afraid of. Thomas called at 3 a.m, and the sound of his voice told me everything before he finished the first sentence. "Margaret's location has been compromised," he said. "We're handling it. Don't leave the house." I was out of bed before he finished speaking, standing in the dark of the bedroom with my phone pressed against my ear and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the wall, I could hear Daniel and Rachel's room, quiet, no movement, either asleep or very good at pretending. "How bad?" I said. She got out. A pause that carried the weight of something he wasn't saying yet. "She's been hit in the shoulder. She's stable." But Walter, they were professionals. 3 people in and out in under 4 minutes. They knew exactly where to look and exactly what they were looking for. "The box phone," I said. "Yes, they didn't find it. Margaret never kept everything in one place." Another pause. "I need you to come in. Not now, wait until morning. Tell Rachel you have an appointment at the office. Something routine." I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and pressed my free hand flat against my knee to stop it from shaking, and I thought about Margaret Cole moving through some small safe house in the middle of the night with a bullet wound in her shoulder and a metal box tucked under her other arm. I was at Thomas's temporary office by 8:15. Margaret was there when I arrived, her left arm in a sling, a bruise running along her jaw that hadn't been there the last time I saw her. She looked up when I came through the door and said, "Don't," before I could say anything, in the tone of a woman who had already talked herself out of accepting sympathy and wasn't going to be talked back into it. "All right," I said, and sat down. Thomas was standing in front of his monitor with the expression of a man who has just discovered a structural fault in something he built with his own hands. Kevin Barnes sat across the room with his laptop open, not looking up. "The coordinates of Margaret's location were accessed from inside this unit," Thomas said, "from a workstation registered to my assistant, Sophia Turner." He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed several times in order to be able to say it without their voice changing. "Sophia has been with my team for 4 years. She has exemplary performance reviews. She has a younger brother with significant medical debt, and 6 months ago, someone offered to help with that debt in exchange for occasional information." He stopped. "She didn't fully understand what she was feeding into or who would act on it. That doesn't change what happened." "Where is she now?" I asked. "Gone." Kevin spoke without looking up from his screen. "She left the building yesterday at noon and hasn't returned. We've flagged her passport." I looked at Thomas. "Harold?" "Almost certainly," Thomas said. "Though the payment ran through 3 intermediaries, we're still tracing." Margaret shifted in her chair and winced, a small involuntary tightening around the eyes that she controlled immediately. "The important thing," she said, "is that they still don't have what they came for, which means they still don't know what we have." "For now," I said. Kevin finally looked up. He turned his laptop around so I could see the screen, a calendar with a date circled in red near the end of October. "While we were pulling Sophia's access logs, we found something else. Communication between Northbridge and Daniel about the timing of the final transfer. They're planning to move everything in one night." He tapped the circled date. "World Series Game 7. If it goes that far." "If it doesn't go to Game 7, I asked, "they'll use Game 6. The point is the volume tens of millions of individual betting transactions happening simultaneously across New Jersey and Nevada platforms. It's the perfect cover for moving money at scale without triggering automated monitoring systems." Kevin's voice was steady and factual, the voice of someone explaining a mechanism rather than a catastrophe. "We have a narrow window between when the transactions begin and when they complete. If we don't intercept within that window, the money reaches its destination and the paper trail we need to prove intent disappears." Thomas crossed his arms. "We need a freeze order from a federal judge in place before that night. The legal groundwork starts now." I looked at the circled date on Kevin's screen. 6 months. 6 months of continuing to sit at a kitchen table with Rachel and Daniel, and eating dinner and asking about the weather, and pretending that my wife hadn't been killed, and my name wasn't on $83 million in fraudulent accounts. 6 months, I said. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." I looked up at Margaret, who was watching me with the clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who had spent 3 years already waiting for exactly this. "We do it right, or we don't do it at all." That's what Eleanor would have said. Margaret's jaw tightened. Her good hand pressed flat against the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. "Yes," she said, her voice rough at the edges, in a way she didn't bother to smooth over. That is exactly what she would have said. Thomas cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Margaret, we need to get you to Manhattan. When the night comes, you're going to need to be inside that building before Daniel's people lock it down." Margaret looked at him steadily. "How much lead time do I get?" "Enough," Thomas said. "We'll make sure of it." I drove home through morning traffic with both hands on the wheel, counting the things I knew for certain, the way I used to count. Verified line items in a clean audit. Margaret was alive. The box was safe. Harold didn't know we were ready. And somewhere in a post office box on a street Eleanor had walked down 100 times, a black notebook was waiting with the map that was going to end all of it. 6 months. I could do 6 months. 6 months is a long time to carry something heavy without letting it change the way you walk. I managed. Not perfectly. There were mornings when I sat at the kitchen table across from Rachel and felt the weight of everything I knew pressing against the back of my teeth, and I had to focus on the coffee cup in front of me and breathe through it the way you breathe through physical pain steadily, without letting your face show what your body is doing. But I managed. Rachel and Daniel stayed through April and into May, then found reasons to visit less frequently as the summer wore on, a work trip, a conference, a weekend away, and I let the distance grow between us without chasing it, because it was easier to carry what I carried when I didn't have to look at my daughter across a dinner table every night. By October, I had stopped flinching at the sound of Rachel's name. The invitation to Daniel's World Series party arrived in late September, a printed card, which struck me as a choice since Daniel was the kind of man who usually communicated through platforms and apps. The Penthouse. October 25th. Cocktails at 7, game at 8. Business casual. We'd love to have you there, Dad. It would mean a lot to both of us. I accepted. Thomas told me to. The city was cold and bright on the evening of the 25th. The kind of New York October night that felt deliberately cinematic, sharp air leaves against the sidewalk. The distant sound of traffic from 3 blocks away carrying up through Daniel's floor-to-ceiling windows like a soundtrack. I took the train down from Albany and checked into a hotel 2 blocks from the building, and I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my good suit and thought about Eleanor, who had once told me that the hardest thing about being honest was that it required you to be the same person in every room. The elevator opened onto Daniel's penthouse at 7:15. He was waiting. Of course he was waiting. Daniel Cross was always positioned exactly where he intended to be. He crossed the room with his hand extended and his face arranged into the warm, expansive welcome of a host who is genuinely delighted you came. And I shook his hand and felt the particular coldness that comes not from the handshake, but from knowing exactly what the hand had done. Walter. He gripped my shoulder with his free hand. You have no idea how glad I am you're here. Rachel's been worried about you. We both have. I'm better, I said. Getting there. The penthouse held perhaps 40 people, business contacts. A pair of city officials I recognized from Albany. 3 lawyers Rachel had introduced me to at some point over the years. Someone had set up a large screen on the far wall showing the pre-game coverage, and the room had the particular energy of people who were there partly for the baseball and partly for each other, and mostly for whatever the evening was going to turn into once the business of watching a game gave them permission to relax. Harold Vance stood near the bar with a glass of red wine, his silver hair catching the light, his posture carrying the practiced ease of a man who had never in his life needed to think about whether he belonged in a room. He saw me and raised his glass, and I raised mine, and we didn't cross the room to each other, which was the first time in 22 years that had ever happened. Rachel found me 20 minutes in. She looked beautiful and exhausted in equal measure. A black dress, her mother's pearls, dark circles under her eyes that even careful makeup couldn't fully address. She hugged me with both arms, and her grip was tighter than usual, and I held her back and thought about the audio recording on Eleanor's phone and the draft email Rachel had written to the FBI and never sent. I'm glad you came, she said, pulling back to look at me. I'm glad you invited me, I said. She searched my face for something I wasn't sure what, and then nodded slightly, as though she'd found either what she was looking for or the absence of it, and turned to flag down a server with a tray of appetizers. The first pitch was at 8:04. Thomas had explained it to me 2 days earlier. The freeze order required documented evidence of active criminal intent, not just preparation, but execution. Judge Holloway had agreed to sign the moment the first transaction cleared. That was why we couldn't move earlier. We needed them to start. We had filed the application 3 weeks prior. The paperwork was already in the judge's hands, waiting for the trigger. By the bottom of the second inning, Kevin had confirmed via text that the transactions had begun moving small amounts, first feeding into the network of sports betting accounts in New Jersey and Nevada. The numbers too modest to trigger automated surveillance flags, but accumulating with the patient, deliberate velocity of something that knew exactly where it was going. Thomas was letting it run, building the full picture of every account in the chain before the freeze order activated. I watched the game and drank water and laughed at the right moments and listened to a man named Gerald Whitfield explain his theory about why the designated hitter rule had ruined baseball. And the whole time I was aware of Rachel on the far side of the room with her phone in her hand, and Daniel moving between guests with the fluid social efficiency of a man conducting an orchestra only he could hear. At the bottom of the fifth, the transaction velocity slowed. Daniel noticed. I watched it happen from across the room, the fraction of a second pause in his conversation, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the way his gaze moved briefly to the phone in his jacket pocket, before he smiled again and said something that made the man beside him laugh. He excused himself and moved toward the hallway that led to his private office. Harold had been watching Daniel too. His wine glass was still. His eyes tracked Daniel's path across the room, and then they moved just for a moment, quickly, the way a person checks something they don't want to be seen checking to me. I was looking at the screen. A man watching baseball. Harold set his glass down on the bar and took his phone from his pocket and walked to the far corner of the room by the windows, turning slightly away from the party, his shoulders angled toward the glass and the dark city beyond it. Kevin's text came through 4 seconds later. Harold just sent a warning. He knows something is wrong. He's going to try to pull the plug. I set my water glass down carefully. I straightened my jacket. I looked around the room at 40 people watching baseball in a Manhattan penthouse, and I thought about Eleanor standing in a parking garage across the street from this building, photographing her own son-in-law meeting with a man neither of us had known to be afraid of yet. Then I watched Harold pocket his phone, push off from the window, and walk with deliberate, unhurried purpose toward the hallway where Daniel had gone, and I set my glass down and followed him. Harold's voice came through the earpiece before I reached the door. "Stop everything," he said. "Right now. Wipe it all." I stood in the hallway outside Daniel's private office, with my back against the wall, and my heart doing something it hadn't done since the night I drove to meet Thomas for the first time, hammering with a rhythm that felt less like fear and more like the body finally recognizing that the thing it has been bracing for has arrived. I could hear Daniel inside the fast-clipped efficiency of a man executing a contingency plan he had prepared for and hoped never to use. The sound of typing, a drawer opening and closing. Then Rachel's voice, sharp and sudden, "Stop!" A beat of silence, not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of a room where everyone has just recalibrated. "Rachel." Daniel's voice dropped into the low, controlled register he used when he wanted someone to understand he was serious. "This is not the time. I said stop." Her voice was steadier than I had ever heard it. Not the steadiness of calm, the steadiness of someone who has been terrified for a very long time and has finally reached the point where the terror has burned itself out and left something harder behind. "Harold, before you say another word, I need you to hear something." The sound that came next was a phone being set on a surface, a few seconds of handling, and then Harold's own voice filling the room, tinny and compressed by the recording, but unmistakably the voice I had heard at every Wednesday lunch for 22 years. She's getting too close. We need the car dealt with before she reaches the building. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Another voice, brief and assenting. Good. Make sure it looks like the road. The recording ended. Harold said nothing. The quality of his silence was different from any silence I had heard from him before, not the comfortable silence of a man in control of a room, but the silence of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot walk back from, calculating whether there is any move left. That's taken out of context, he said finally. His voice had lost its warmth. What remained was precise and cold, the voice underneath the 22 years of lunches and shoulder gripping, and you're the most honest man in the building. Walter. Rachel. You don't understand what you have. I understand exactly what I have, she said. And so does everyone who's been listening to this room for the past 40 minutes. That was my cue. I opened the door. 3 faces turned toward me. Daniel's went white. Rachel's held something I had not seen on her face since she was very small, a desperate, complicated hope that knew it might not be deserved. Harold's went absolutely still in the way of a man who has just run the calculation and found that every column comes up 0. Walter. Harold's voice recovered its warmth with an effort I could actually see. This isn't what it... Harold. I walked into the room and stood between him and the door. You told me more times than I can count that I was the most honest person in that building. I held his gaze and felt nothing that resembled the grief I had expected to feel in this moment, only the clean, flat finality of a door closing on something that had already ended long before tonight. I used to think that was a compliment. He looked at me for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Behind his eyes, something moved that might have been regret or might have been nothing more than the recognition of a miscalculation. Every document in this arrangement bears your name, Walter, he said. Even if this falls apart tonight, you are the first person any prosecutor looks at. You understand that? Yes, I said. That's why I needed you to say that in front of a recording. Thomas's voice came through the earpiece, quiet and certain. We have everything we need. The freeze order is active. All accounts are locked. Harold's expression changed, a small, involuntary contraction, like a man who has just stepped on something unexpected in the dark. Daniel moved fast. He was across the room and through the side door before anyone could respond, the service corridor that led to the building's technical infrastructure, the route he had presumably identified months ago as the cleanest exit if the evening went wrong. The door closed behind him, and then it opened again from the other side. Margaret Cole stepped through. She was still wearing the sling from the shoulder wound, and the bruise along her jaw had deepened to purple over the past week. And she looked at Daniel with the clear, unhurried regard of a woman who has had 3 years to prepare for this specific moment and intends to use every second of it. Daniel stopped moving. The color left his face so completely that the room seemed to go slightly gray around him. You're dead, he said. It came out barely above a whisper. No, Margaret said. You just needed to believe that. She looked at him steadily, and her voice didn't shake at all. 3 years ago, someone gave a security firm the location of a storage facility. The facility caught fire. The person they were looking for wasn't inside. She tilted her head slightly. The same firm that followed Eleanor down the I-787 in March. Daniel's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, a thing I had never seen from him, a man who always had the next sentence ready. Same firm, Margaret said. Same client. The door from the main hallway opened. Thomas stepped through first, followed by 2 federal agents in jackets that identified them with 3 letters across the back. Kevin came in behind them with a laptop under his arm. Harold turned toward Thomas with the instinct of a man reaching for the nearest authority, which under other circumstances might have been almost funny. "The accounts," Harold said, his voice finding its steel again. "Everything runs through Walter Bennett's name. You can't—" I set the black notebook on the desk. The room went quiet in a different way from before. Not the silence of calculation, but the silence of a door closing on something that had been a long time coming. "Eleanor left 2 notebooks," I said. "The blue one was for you to find. She knew Rachel knew where her files were kept. She knew Daniel would search the house." I opened the cover and laid it flat on the desk. "This one has the complete account map, every intermediate node, every transfer destination, every point where the money can be intercepted." I looked up. Kevin. Kevin was already at the desk, connecting a cable from his laptop to the room's display system. "Freeze order was signed by Judge Patricia Holloway at 9:47 this morning," he said, in the tone of a man reading back a verified fact. "Every account in this diagram has been locked simultaneously. Nothing moved." Harold looked at the notebook, at the screen, at me, and for the first time in 22 years of knowing Harold Vance, I watched him have nothing to say. Rachel was standing near the window with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. She was shaking, not the controlled shaking of someone managing their reaction, but the deep, involuntary shaking of a body that has been holding too much for too long and has finally been given permission to let go. A sound came out of her that she tried to catch with the back of her hand, and couldn't, something between a sob and a gasp, raw and genuine, in a way that nothing else about this evening had been. The agents moved toward Harold, toward Daniel. I walked to Rachel. She looked up at me with her mother's eyes, red-rimmed, wrecked, stripped of every careful layer she had been building for years, and she said in a voice that cracked down the middle, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry." My throat closed around everything I could have said. Around the recording on Eleanor's phone, and the blue notebook, and the burgundy coat, and 22 years of Wednesday lunches, and the 17 months Eleanor had spent in silence, building a case to protect me from my own daughter. "I know," I said. I put my arms around her and held on. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York was doing what New York always does, indifferent and brilliant and entirely unimpressed by the things people do to each other inside its buildings. Somewhere below, someone was honking a horn. A siren passed and faded. The game was still on, somewhere, the crowd noise rising and falling with the particular rhythm of 40,000 people watching something that mattered only because they had agreed it did. Rachel cried against my shoulder until she couldn't anymore. I held her and looked over her head at the black notebook lying open on the desk. Eleanor's handwriting, Eleanor's map. Eleanor's last careful, methodical, devastating act of love. And I thought about a Sunday morning at Washington Park, the two of us crossing the wooden bridge, Eleanor stopping to press her hand against the loose railing and saying with that particular patience of hers, "Not yet. It's not dangerous, just loose." She had known even then that loose things could be useful. She had known so many things I hadn't. Harold was convicted on 14 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and second-degree murder among them. Arthur Brennan testified to the forged signatures, and the case held in every court that heard it. Daniel faces decades. Sophia was arrested at JFK before she could board her flight and cooperated fully once she understood the weight of what she had been part of. Rachel is paying a debt that will take years to settle, and I told her I will be here when she finishes. People ask me if I feel like I won. I don't think that's the right word for what this was. Family stories' revenge rarely arrive the way we imagine. They don't feel like victory. They feel like standing in a quiet room after a long storm, looking at what the wind left behind and deciding what to rebuild. Don't do what I did. Don't confuse trust with attention. The people closest to you deserve both, and so do you. I looked away from my own family for years because I assumed love was enough to hold everything together. It isn't. Love needs to be accompanied by honesty, by presence, by the willingness to ask hard questions before the answers become unavoidable. In family drama, revenge, the villain wears a stranger's face. In my life, they sat at my table and called me Dad. I believe God kept me standing through all of it, not to protect me from the truth, but to make sure I was strong enough to face it. The family drama revenge we survive changes us. The family stories revenge we carry forward, those are the ones that matter. Dad family revenge exists because stories like this one deserve to be told. If this one reached you, if any part of it felt familiar, leave a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there are more stories coming that I think you'll want to be here for. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements shaped for reflection and meaningful storytelling. Names, places, and details are coincidental, but the message inside every story is something worth carrying with you.